I'll do that to let some air flow out. Genesis 40. Yep. Is it? Do you have to break up the pizza party? All right, let's go ahead and we'll get started. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 40, so you guys can make your way to that. I'm going to go ahead and pray. Father, we thank you for this evening, and Lord, I lift up our time together tonight, Lord. I pray that it would be honoring and pleasing to you, Lord. I pray that as we study your word, as we continue looking at Joseph and his life, Lord, that you would encourage and strengthen us. And Lord, as we see the way that he's dealt with and we see your hand throughout his life, Lord, we can rest in the reality that we serve the same God who's unchanging. Lord, I just thank you for these truths. I thank you for these things that we're going to be able to look at and see, and just pray that you would fill us all fresh with your Spirit. Lord, that we would be, our hearts would be prepared, and we just give you this time tonight, and we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we're in Genesis chapter 40. Last week we talked about Joseph and being sold into slavery. Just kind of thinking about the story of Joseph's life. This young man who is despised, he's rejected, he's hated by his brothers, he's sold into slavery, ripped away from his family, betrayed by his brothers, and then he finds himself in Potiphar's house in Egypt. He gets purchased in Egypt, and the Lord he finds favor there. It says that the Lord was with Joseph. It's something that we see throughout his, while he finds himself in Potiphar's house, the Lord is with him. He finds himself in prison after that, and the Lord is with him. And we just see this continual theme of the Lord being with him throughout his life, and even in the midst of challenges and really pretty horrible circumstances, the Lord is with him. As he's in Potiphar's house, we looked at it last week, and you see this situation with Potiphar's wife as she's making advances towards Joseph, and we looked at that a little bit, but he flees from that. As this is taking place, he flees, he leaves his coat behind, and eventually he's thrown into prison as a result of it. She accuses him of trying to come onto her, and he's thrown into prison. So that's where we left him last week. He's in prison. It says that the Lord was with Joseph, and the Lord showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And he's given him authority in prison. He's kind of overseeing everything. It says that the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there is his doing. So now picking up in verse 1 of chapter 40, it says, "It came to pass after these things that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. And the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while." A couple interesting things already to note is that, it's just kind of curious as we're looking at this and considering back to where, as Joseph was in Potiphar's house, that Potiphar was the captain of the guard. And here it says that he was put in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison. You kind of wonder if this is Potiphar. Is the prison, the captain of the guard, the prison here where the king sent people to prison, is it under the rule of Potiphar? And it's just kind of adds a little bit of depth to the story that the captain of the guard, again perhaps Potiphar, charged Joseph with these guys while he's in prison, and he serves them. So you have the baker, the chief baker, and the chief butler, and they're both in prison, and Joseph has been tasked with serving these guys and kind of tending to these guys. It says in verse 5, "Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, 'Why do you look so sad today?'" Even that just gives us a little bit more insight into Joseph and Joseph's heart, that he's given this role of, like, he's being tasked with tending to these guys and serving these guys there in the prison. And he can even see, like, their countenance. There's something about them on this particular day that they're more down than normal. And he's concerned about it, and he asks them about it. He asked, "Why do you look so sad today?" And they said to him, "We have each had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it." So Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please." Then the chief butler told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And Joseph said to him, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into this dungeon. So he interprets the dream of the butler, and as he gives him this interpretation, he asks him, hey, look, when you're released from here, when the Pharaoh comes and as you're restored back to your position, please remember me. And this is really the first time that we see him pleading his case at all. I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews and have done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Pharaoh had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So let's just real quick kind of consider this situation. And as we do this, I just want to remember, kind of be reminded of what's led Joseph to this place again. Again, starting as a child and just this child with integrity, this child who, as he goes out into the fields and he sees his father's resources being mismanaged, he sees his brothers, essentially stealing from the father, and as he comes back in and brings a report, and because of this integrity that he has, there's these issues at home, and he starts to become resented by his brothers. They get resentful in the way that they're dealing with him. Again, he's sent out to check on them, and as he's being sent out to check on them, they see him coming, and they're plotting already as they see him coming. They first talk about killing him, and then eventually they throw him into this hole, initially to leave him for dead. They take his coat from him, but then as they see these merchants coming, they sell him to these merchants, and he finds himself in Egypt as a slave, and just a horrific set of circumstances that this guy has dealt with. As 17 years old, as he's sold into slavery at 17 years old, he finds himself in Potiphar's house, and then not only as a slave, but then dealing with this ongoing, we don't know how long, but it says day by day by day, this ongoing issue with Potiphar's wife, and then the false accusations, and not just false accusations, but pretty heinous false accusations that he's dealing with now, and then he's being thrown into prison. So there's that 11 years that he's in Potiphar's house, and then he finds himself in prison, and he interprets the dream for this butler and for the baker, and he says, hey, when you see the Pharaoh, remember me and remind him, let him know what happened. And then this guy's released, and then he forgets about him. And so, as we read through this, and we're going to look at a couple other things as we go through this next chapter and tie this up tonight. But I don't want to lose sight of just how long this was. Like, this was a long ordeal that Joseph is dealing with, and we know the end of the story, and we see the position that he gets put in, and second in command in all of Egypt, and we see the authority, and we see the resources and the money and all the other stuff that he has, and it's easy to look at that and lose sight of this long period of time, years and years and years of not only injustice and mistreatment, but the resentfulness and the being despised. And really being alone. Like it was years and years and years of loneliness, other than the fact that God was with him, that the Lord was with him, and that he found favor in the sight of the Lord. But as far as his relationship with man is concerned, it's just been one betrayal after another. It's just been one rejection after another. And it's been this ongoing thing. And not only that, but it's began at a young age, at 17 years old. And I can't imagine being in that place at that age and dealing with that level of betrayal and that level of resentment. And it's all unfounded. It's not that he did anything to deserve it. It's not that he was causing trouble or anything like that. But essentially he's resented because of his integrity and because of his character. So the chief butler forgot Joseph. He did not remember him. Then verse 1 of chapter 41, it says, "Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years." So now we're 2 years later that the butler had forgotten about Joseph. 2 years later, the Pharaoh has a dream, and behold, in his dream he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. Then the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. So now the Pharaoh, again, you picture the situation. You got Joseph still in prison, forgotten about. 2 years have gone by, and just the time. And I mean, you got to wonder what's going on, what he's thinking about, what's going on in his heart, what's going on in his mind as he's forgotten about, and just the wonder, man. Like, he's found favor in the eyes of the Lord, and he's been, the Lord is there with him, but still he's in prison. Like, he didn't do anything to end up in this place, and now again being forgotten about, again this even feeling of the rejection, of the despising, and this time is going on. Meanwhile, on the other side, you have Pharaoh and his home, and he's had these dreams, and he's troubled by these dreams. And I think that there's something interesting. I don't think that every time the Pharaoh has a dream, or every time the butler or the baker has a dream, that there's this, I need to get an interpretation for it. I think there's something unique here, and to the point with the Pharaoh where he's troubled enough that he's like, man, this must mean something, and he tries to get all the wise men, all the magicians together. Nobody can interpret the dream. I think it's similar with the butler and with the baker also, where they were clearly troubled by these dreams that they had, and these dreams have to have some kind of a meaning. So the interpretation comes from the Lord. The magicians aren't able to interpret it. The wise men aren't able to interpret it. So verse 9, the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day, when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. So he's saying, like, oh man, I remember something I was supposed to remember a while ago, but that time when you were upset with me and put me in prison, me and the baker, we both had this dream. We each dreamed according to the interpretation. The interpretation of the dream was correct. Exactly what happened is what we were told. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, And they brought him quickly out of the dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is one who can interpret it, and there's no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Now, again, just step back for a second, and I want to kind of keep building this as we're going through, but considering Joseph, considering everything that he's been through, all the experiences that he's had, now he's up to this place where he's been in prison for 2 extra years that he's been forgotten about while he's been there in prison. And then the Pharaoh, all of a sudden, he's, I wonder what it's like as he's sitting there. Imagine the feeling of the message coming, like, hey, to this guy Joseph, hey, the Pharaoh's asking specifically to see you. And then the process of, hey, I got to get cleaned up real quick. And he gets cleaned up and he shaves and he changes his clothes, and then he comes before the Pharaoh. And then the Pharaoh's saying, look, I've had this dream. There's nobody that can interpret it, but I've heard that you're able to interpret dreams. And then even his response there, he's like, it's not me. I can't interpret dreams, but God's able to interpret it. I just think that's, again, it's just so telling of the heart of Joseph and of the character of Joseph, where I would think that if you found yourself in this situation, especially after all of this time, 11 years in Potiphar's house, 2 years plus in prison, now all of a sudden you're standing before the Pharaoh, you would think you'd want to sell yourself a little bit. This is kind of your one opportunity here. And even his response to the Pharaoh is like, it's not me, man. I'm not able to interpret dreams. The Lord can do it. So the Pharaoh says to Joseph, he says, behold, in my dream, I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt, such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up in one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout the land of Egypt. But after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be kept as a reserve for the land for that 7 years of famine, for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So, again, consider the situation. You have Joseph, a Hebrew, who serves God. He's come into Egypt, a pagan land that there's no godly precedent in Egypt. There's no serving God in Egypt, but it's clear to Potiphar that the Lord has shown favor to Joseph, to the point where he's given authority in Potiphar's house. As he finds himself in prison again, this unknown God to the Egyptians, has shown himself to have favor towards Joseph again in prison, and Joseph has given authority there in prison. Now he finds himself standing before the Pharaoh, and everything that he's saying, he's taking it back to the Lord. That God has interpreted this dream. God has given Pharaoh this dream twice to reinforce what he's doing. God is going to bring these things to pass. And it's amazing to me, and it's only by the hand of God, it's only by the grace of God that that Joseph has given an ear in this. And imagine, it tells us the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and the eyes of all his servants. It's such an amazing thing that this man, this Hebrew slave who they just brought out of prison, they just cleaned him up and brought him out of prison, they stand him before the Pharaoh. Not only does he boldly interpret this dream, not only does he say, look, this is what God said is going to happen, but it's a pretty wild interpretation. And it's like with the butler and with the baker, both of those were like, hey, in 3 days, this very specific thing is going to happen. So if it doesn't happen within 3 days, then, it can be proven pretty quickly. Here, it's like, dude, there's going to be 7 years, but not just 7 years, but 7 years of plenty. And I think that, we understand and we can look, and I think we even see it. We've seen it in our country come in waves, but when you find yourself in that place of plenty, it's hard to imagine that a famine's coming. I think that's when that's when you really let walls down. That's when things are going really good. That's when you start to become less and less dependent on the Lord. You let walls come down. You get a little prideful. You get a little arrogant. And it's hard to believe when everything is good, when everything's going right, it's hard to believe that something bad's going to follow this. And he's given him this interpretation that, look, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and then there's going to be 7 years of a famine. So for this dream to be proven, it's going to take at least 7 years before that famine even begins. And so he's given the Pharaoh this interpretation. Not only that, but he's given him some pretty crazy solution to this too. Hey, you need to start imposing a 20% tax on everything that is harvested, and we need to take 20% of everything and start storing it away in all of Egypt for this presumed famine that's going to come in 7 years from now. Imagine, and the governmental structure is a little different there, but imagine this being presented to the people, that, hey, the guy in charge, the Pharaoh, had a dream. Some Hebrew slave that they just took out of prison interpreted the dream. This is what he said is going to happen, so we're going to start imposing this 20% tax on top of everything else to store up for this famine that's going to come in 7 years from now. It's crazy. And it's only by the grace of God. Like, it's the favor of the Lord that's taken place in this. And not only that, but then the advice seemed good to the Pharaoh and to all of his servants. So it wasn't just a snap decision. It's not like the Pharaoh's just like, hey, that makes sense, let's do it. The Pharaoh sat down and got counsel from his council, from all of his servants, and the advice seemed good to everybody. Another thing that's just wild to me is how bold Joseph is. Like, not only he was only asked to interpret the dream. Nobody asked him, hey, what do you think we should do about this? And so he interprets the dream, and he's like, look, man, let me tell you what you ought to do about this. And he gives them this advice. He gives them this counsel. The advice was good in the eyes of the Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God? And that's kind of the kicker there. Again, it's amazing to me. We saw it with Isaac and Abimelech. We saw it with Abraham, and we see it with these other guys as they find themselves in these pagan nations. And there's this understanding. There's this this realization that there's something different about these guys, that there's a true living God that goes before these men, and these men find favor. These men are blessed. These men are provided for by the true living God. And as the Pharaoh is asking his counselors, he's saying, look, Can we find anybody like this? Somebody who's wise and in whom dwells the Spirit of God, in whom is the Spirit of God. It's an interesting thing to me that's like part of the prerequisites of the guy that's going to come alongside and be used in this situation. Is there a man who's this wise, who in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. So the Pharaoh takes off his signet ring. So by Joseph being in possession of the signet ring means that Joseph can write any law he wants. Like, this guy has ultimate authority. He has authority over everything in Egypt except for the throne. And again, like, let's just stop for a second and consider the timeline that's led up to this. All the issues at home, the rejection from his brothers, being thrown into the pit, being drug out of the pit and sold into slavery. Just that drive, the ride from Shechem to Egypt. Like, was he in the back of was he in a cart with like bars on the cart? Was he being led in shackles? How did he make his way from Shechem all the way back to Egypt with these traders, with these merchants? He's sold into slavery. He's remember, we talked about it a couple weeks ago, that this is a young Hebrew man who has no Egyptian language training, no culture or anything like that. Like, he's having to learn all of this. As he comes into Potiphar's house, he's having to learn the language. He's having to learn the culture. He's having to learn, just all of these things he's experiencing. And then being in prison, and then finally getting the call that hey, the Pharaoh wants to see you. He comes out, he interprets the dream, he gives him this advice, and the advice is well received. And then finally the Pharaoh, his response after this council meeting, and it doesn't tell us, was this a couple days later, a couple weeks later, was it a couple hours later? He has Joseph in front of him, and he says, "Look, man, there's nobody as wise in all of Egypt. You are the second in command in everything." Gives him his signet ring, gives him these clothes of fine linen, gives him the second chariot to ride in, puts the garments of fine linen, puts a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." So he set him over all the land of Egypt. I wonder at what point was he reminded of the dream that he had, of the dreams that he had when he was a child, when he shared these dreams with his brothers, and that their stalks were going to bow down to his, and then the other dream that he had about the stars and everything bowing down, and I wonder at what point did this finally click, and even like as his father, as he was rebuked by his father, and he said, "What, are your mother and I and your brothers all going to bow down to you?" Like, at what point did this click when he realized, oh my goodness, this is here, he's driving around on the chariot and all of Egypt is crying out before him to bow the knee. So the Pharaoh set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, and he gave him as wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain, as the sand of the sea, until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. Now, again, I just think about this, this 7 years of plenty. And all of this is going off of Joseph's interpretation of this dream. So, I don't want to speculate too much. I don't want to go down this road too much, but like, what are the people thinking? Like, there's this 30-year-old, like this young dude who's come in and he's going around and he's gathering, he's taking, like, the crops are producing. Like, business is good. Everything is good right now. Like, why? I don't understand why we're having to do all this and stockpile all this. And again, the mentality, and I don't know how much different it was then, but now it just seems like one of those things where it's like, when things are good, when things are plenty, when things are abundant, you're not really thinking about, hey, we need to really start storing things away because it's going to get gnarly soon. Like, there's just this really unique obedience that not only do you see in Joseph, but like I said before, it's the grace of God that I would say that it's the grace of God that this guy's not getting lynched in every city that he goes to. And again, you just got this 30-year-old foreigner who's come in, and now he's coming through and he's taking all of our crops and all of our grain and everything, and he's building up these storehouses, and at least it's staying there in the city. At least it's not being like all taken somewhere else, but he's leaving it where it is. But he's just really stocking things up, and obviously at least he believes in the interpretation that was given. But Joseph gathered very much grain as the sands of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. And to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. We're going to come back and talk about that in just a second. We're going to go through the end of this chapter real quick. Verse 53 says, Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. The famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, Go to Joseph, whatever he says to you do. The famine was over all the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph and Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Now, again, we're another 7 years later. So Joseph is 37, 38 at this point, 39. Like, he's getting into that age. And this sort of, at least this part of the journey began when he was 17, being sold into slavery. And you just see this, like, this sort of pounding that this guy has taken throughout his life, and the rejection, the being despised, the loneliness, all of these other things, and how easy it would be. And this is where I think that the application comes in, and what we can kind of glean from this is the timing of the Lord. Like, God's timing is perfect in this. And here we are on this side of it, so we can look back and we can gloss over, like, we can really skim through that 13 years or however long, 12, 13 years between 17 and 30. We can jump over that pretty quick. But I would tell you, I would assume that was a pretty long 13 years, that he's wondering where God is in the midst of all of it, not realizing that the whole time God is setting this whole thing up. God is orchestrating all of this. The Lord, he even says, Joseph says at the end in chapter 50, when he's standing before his brothers, he says, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And God used this situation. God used the slavery. God used the being thrown into the pit and drug out of the pit and sold to the traders, and that long, dusty, just gross journey into Egypt, finding himself in Egypt, finding himself in slavery, the accusations, all of these things that are coming against him. God's using all of this, unbeknownst to Joseph or anybody else, to raise Joseph up to be the one who's going to save the whole world at this time. And not just the whole world, but primarily and more specifically the people of Israel, the chosen people, the patriarchs. Jacob is going to send Joseph's brothers. All of them are going to come into Egypt. And actually it tells us it tells us later on, well, it tells us in chapter 50, we won't go to that right now, or one of those last chapters, as they start to come in, that Joseph sends for his father, he sends for the whole house, he brings 75 people end up coming, and he's providing for them, and God's the redemptive plan. As we've been going through Genesis, we've been talking about that as we got into, well, even in the garden, but then as we got into Abraham, and the covenant that God made with Abraham, that the Messiah was going to come, that through Abraham's seed, that all the nations of the world were going to be blessed. And that covenant continues on with Isaac. And then that covenant continues on with Jacob. And then it continues on with Judah. And it goes down that road. But the Lord uses Joseph in this situation to preserve that covenant. And it takes Joseph being sold into slavery. It takes Joseph being an outcast. It takes Joseph finding himself in prison. It takes the rejection. It takes all of these things that he's experienced to preserve the covenant that God had made with Abraham. That through Abraham, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. And through Isaac and through Jacob and through Judah. And by the hand of Joseph, by the obedience, by the integrity, by the character of Joseph, the Lord used him in this situation and elevated him and built him up to this position to where he was going to be able to preserve all of the countries of the world came to Egypt or came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all the lands. Now I want to jump back to verse 51 and 52, and we're going to look at this and again sort of springboard off of this into the application for us. And so it says, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Again, it was years. It was many years of the Lord working on Joseph, working in the heart of Joseph. Joseph was this man that had integrity. He fled from Potiphar's wife. He said, how could I commit this great wickedness? How could I sin against the Lord? It was this man who was compassionate. They're in prison as the butler and the baker, like their countenance is off. And he's checking on them. Like there's something unique about this guy that we see. But it was years and years and years of the Lord working on and preparing his heart, bringing him to the place where he names his second child Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. And I wonder if you were to ask Joseph, or it's kind of funny, like if you could go to Joseph, 10 years prior to this and say, hey, the day's going to come when you're going to have a child, and this is what his name is going to be, and you're going to name him that because God has caused you to be fruitful in the land of your affliction, probably would have been laughed at because of that. But now he's in this place and he has this perspective, and the Lord has over time, as the Lord is orchestrating all these other things behind the scenes as well, he's working on the heart of Joseph. And what we'll come to find out also is that he's working on the hearts of his brothers who are back home. And he's working on the heart of his father. And he's working in this land. He's working in Egypt, and he's working. It's just amazing to see how the Lord does this. I'm always blown away when you consider how God is so efficient at accomplishing so many different things through single sets of circumstances. And this is a great example that Joseph has found himself there in Egypt. And it's easy to look at this, and Joseph is sort of the main character of the story at the time. So Joseph is who we're following. Joseph is who we're talking about. But the reality is that while the Lord is working here on Joseph, there's work that's going on behind the scenes back home. There's work that's going on behind the scenes in the prison. There's the baker and the butler did something to upset the Pharaoh, which ended up getting them put in prison. And you see the Lord orchestrating all of these things step by step to eventually leading to the point where Joseph is standing before the Pharaoh and interpreting this dream. The Lord has caused him to be fruitful in the land of his affliction. Again, he names his firstborn Manasseh, for God has caused me to forget. God has made me forget all my toil in all my father's house. Now let's jump from there real quick to Acts chapter 7. And when we were going through Acts, it's been a little while now since we were in Acts chapter 7, but we talked about this specifically. But in Acts chapter 7, verse 9, and this is as Stephen is standing there making his address, and he's kind of going over a history of the nation of Israel, of the people. Chapter 7, verse 9, it says, "And the patriarchs, being Joseph's brothers, the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him and delivered him out of all his troubles." Now, when we were going through Acts, we looked at this and made an interesting point, and we've kind of been talking about it tonight. So we have this pretty large chunk of time where Joseph, 17-year-old kid, and even trouble before that, but 17 years old when he's sold into slavery. And then it's not till he's 30 years old when he's standing before the Pharaoh. 2 years being forgotten about in prison, all the other stuff that he's dealing with. This guy has dealt with some trouble. He has had some troubles. And I love this account here because it says, "And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him and delivered him out of all of his troubles." And that's it, like 13 years worth of troubles and more than that. But all of these troubles are condensed down into that one thought, that God delivered him from his troubles. And when we were going through Acts, we were talking about this specifically. And the same is going to be true for all of us. That while we're here, while we're breathing, while we're still in this tent, we still bear the marks. We still carry the burden of the old man. Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 7. "Who will deliver me from this body of death?" He says, "I thank God through Jesus Christ my Lord." That is, as long as we're here, and again in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he talks about that we're living in this tent, but the day's going to come that we're going to shed this, and we're going to live in new bodies that are eternal, that are not made with hands. But as long as we're here, there's going to be trials. There's going to be tribulations. There's going to be sufferings. But the day's going to come for every single one of us where this is going to be true, that all of that could be condensed into this, but God was with him and delivered him out of all of his troubles. Like the day is going to come when that's what's going to be said. God was with him and delivered him out of all of his troubles. And all of the troubles are going to be so insignificant at that point. Like it's going to be, it'll be nothing. Just like Paul says, "I glory in tribulations," knowing what God's producing through the tribulations. That through tribulations, he's producing patience. Patience produces character. Character produces hope. And we see how the Lord is using tribulation. We see how the Lord in Joseph's life was using toil, was using suffering to produce something so much greater, to where now on the other side of it, what's remembered about his trials is that God was with him and delivered him out of all his troubles. It's condensed down into not even a full sentence. And again, that's going to be the truth for all of us as we look forward to that. And you know, as we look forward to his return, with anticipation, we see that. And then it goes on and it says that he delivered him out of all of his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. Now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers, and Joseph's family became known to the Pharaoh. Then Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all his relatives to him, 75 people. And so you just see the Lord using Joseph and allowing him, the Lord allowed Joseph to experience some pretty gnarly things. Like, again, I keep, for some reason, I keep picturing just him being thrown into this pit. And that was just one of many, many things. But I can't imagine, man, as a child, your older brother's throwing you into this pit with the intention of leaving you for dead. And then you hear them walk away, like eventually you don't hear footsteps anymore and you're left there like just wondering. They take your coat and then eventually they come back and they pull you out. Like, do you think you're being rescued or what are you thinking? And then they sell you to these merchants that are coming by, like all of these things. But and the Lord rescued him. The Lord gave him favor. The Lord allowed all of those things to happen. He allowed Joseph to experience that. The Lord allowed Joseph to be falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. He allowed his reputation to be slandered for a time so that he could orchestrate these things and bring him to a place where he's standing there in front of the Pharaoh. Now, let's go back to Psalm chapter 139 real quick. And I just want to think about this, like in the context of suffering and in the context of especially that feeling of loneliness. I mean, I know what that feels like. I'm sure that all of us have at some point had that feeling of that being alone and even the wondering. Like, I think Joseph, and I think fairly, Joseph could sit there and wonder, where is God in this situation? Like, man, I found myself, like, here we are, I'm in slavery, I'm in this pit, I'm in slavery, I'm in prison, all these things. Where is the Lord in this? And I love how David says this in Psalm 139, verse 13, and this is a familiar section, but David says, "For you formed my inward parts, you covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, and skillfully wrought in the lowest parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written, the days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God! How great is the sum of them! If I should count them, they would be more in number than the sand. When I awake, I am still with you." And while that's true for David, as David writes this, the same is true for us. The same was true for Joseph. Like when Joseph was in that pit, when Joseph was however he was being transported back to Egypt, when Joseph, I mean, just imagine his first night there in Potiphar's house. Everybody's speaking a different language. You can't understand anything. You have no idea what is about to happen. You have no idea what your future looks like. This is still the truth, that God's thoughts towards you are precious and they can't be numbered. Like that's the reality. And so when we find ourselves in that place, whatever that place might be, that's the truth. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God? How great is the sum of them? If I should count them, they'd be like this. They'd be more than the number in the sand. Back in Psalm 138, in verse 7, it says, "Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you will revive me. You will stretch out your hand against the wrath of my enemies, and your right hand will save me. The Lord will perfect that which concerns me. Your mercy, O Lord, endures forever. Do not forsake the work of your hands." And again, I think another thing that Joseph, although he was before David, could set, it's still, even before David wrote this is true of the Lord. But the Lord will perfect that which concerns me. Jump with me real quick over to Philippians chapter 1, and we're going to end with this. The Lord will perfect that which concerns me. Realize that the Lord has, we talk about this all the time, that it pleases the Lord where he's placed you in the body, and the Lord rejoices to see the plumb line in your hand, whatever it is that you're doing. In Philippians chapter 1, verse 3, as Paul writes this to the church in Philippi, he says, "I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making requests for you all with joy, for your fellowship in the gospel from the first day until now, being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ." And that's a truth of God. That's a truth of the character of God in the heart of the Lord, that while it's true for the church in Philippi, it's true for the church today. It's true for all of us, and that we can be confident in this thing that God, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. That the gifts and the callings of God are irrevocable, that God does not make mistakes, that he doesn't call people and then wish that he hadn't done that he made a mistake in this situation or that the Lord allows us to experience tribulation. Again, look at Joseph's life and how the Lord allowed things to take place. And all of it was the story. All of it was the testimony of Joseph as the Lord is carrying him through and building him up till eventually he's the second in command in Egypt. And he's the one that the Lord uses to save his people. And not just his people, but the whole world that's experiencing this famine. And so here with us, with you, with me, this is the truth. That being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. And then Paul goes on, he says, just as it is right for me to think this of you all, because I have you in my heart, and as much as both in my chains and in the defense of the confirmation of the gospel, you are all partakers with me of grace. And that, again, true for us. Like, you are all partakers with me in grace, whether it's in chains, whether it's in the defense of the gospel, whatever it might be. We're all partakers in grace with each other. For God is my witness, how greatly I long for you all with the affection of Jesus Christ. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, that you may approve the things that are excellent, that you may be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. So we'll wrap up here. Next week we're going to just continue on with the story. But man, I would ask you guys, I would encourage you to make this your prayer as well. And know that this is my prayer for you. This is my prayer for us, for this fellowship, and just for the body of Christ, that as Joseph finds himself in that situation in Egypt, we find ourselves in this situation in Tarpon Springs, and the Lord is building his church. The Lord has called, the Lord has orchestrated, and we want to be found faithful. Joseph was found faithful. That the Lord was with him. He found favor in the Lord. God showed favor to him, and the Lord delivered him from all of his trouble. And we can rest in that same hope and in that same promise that we're going to be delivered from our trouble as quickly as Joseph was. And this I pray, that your love may abound still more and more in knowledge and all discernment, being able to approve the things that are excellent, that you'd be sincere and without offense till the day of Christ, being filled with the fruits of righteousness, which are by Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. So I'm going to go ahead and close us in prayer, and then we can shut that off and then see if we have any questions or comments. Father, I do thank you for these truths, Lord. I thank you for this word. I thank you for all of these examples we have, Lord, as we've started in Genesis at the beginning of the year, Lord, the examples that we've seen in Adam and Abel, Lord, and the examples in Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and on and on and on, Lord. Lord, I thank you for those. As we're studying and looking at Joseph right now, I pray, Lord, that you would make our hearts to be positioned in a place where we would have that eternal perspective, Lord, that we would have confidence in you and trust in you, Lord, that you would help us to grow in those areas. Lord, help us to grow in our understanding. Help us to grow in our love for each other. Lord, I just pray that you would be, that we would be strengthened in you, Lord. And Lord, I do pray that our love for each other would just abound more and more, that it would spill out just beyond this place, but Lord, out into the city and into the community that you've called us to. Lord, I pray that the world would know that we are your disciples by our love for one another. Lord, as people are looking for truth, as people are looking for stability and consistency and genuineness, Lord, I pray that as ambassadors of Christ, Lord, that we would be that. Lord, that we would reflect you rightly in everything, and we do pray that you would come quickly. Lord, we just thank you for all you do, and we ask this in Jesus'